Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is another what if all this. I can't ever say his fucking name. People always say under the reactions how to say it, but I always end up forgetting. But I mean, this king, this absolute goat. I mean, if you haven't checked him out, links in the description to his channel. His videos are banging. And the video is the crisis of the 21st century. I've had quite a lot of suggestions for this, and this did actually pop up in my suggested recently, and obviously on my subscription feed because I've subscribed to his channel. And yeah, man, I was always going to react to this. It was just a matter of like sort of when I was going to do it. I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm going to post the parts at the same time, but I'm just going to post this in two parts because I'm expecting like a delivery at around, well, it's 11:35, so it should be around halfway through this video. Probably going to end up being late. I'm not too sure, but yeah, so I'm going to be splitting this into two parts. But yeah, I love this channel. I do really enjoy his videos, and you seem to really want this reaction. And I mean, yeah, we'll see what this video sort of predicts or what he sort of says in it. But yeah, let's get into this. Quick shout out to my Instagram and Twitter before we get into the video. Links in the description for those interested. On the way to 10k on my Instagram. So yeah, I'd appreciate any little follow there or whatever, or just whatever it is. But yeah, same for Patreon. Links in the description for that. Yeah, I do a lot of Patreon only videos. And I mean, yeah, that's about it really. Part one here. We're going to do part two around halfway through. I'm going to be posting at the same time, like I've said. But let's just check this out. Let's see what he has to say. And yeah, man.
Doom's overrated. There are always too many of them, and if you look at their track, being a prophet of Doom's overrated. There are always too many of them, and if you look at their track record, they generally don't correlate well with actually having horrific events. However, it's a good way of getting attention. If you write an article saying the world's ending, you'll get far more publicity than if you say one in which the world will gradually improve today. However, it's sometimes warranted.
Scaremongering, isn't it? Is that what's called scaremongering? Something like that? I remember when the virus started, it was just so negative. I mean, it wasn't a good thing, but genuinely scaring people, the lives out of people. I was scared for a little bit. And that's what the news does. You say stuff that's negative, or you make it sound even worse than it actually is, and you're going to get more clicks. It's true.
What I'm trying to sell you here is that the world as we know it will end in the next few decades. Like it generally has every 200 to 400 years, and it'll probably end up with a happy ending. Intrigued? Let me explain.
Okay. I'm interested to see where he's going to go here.
History is often difficult to learn in its full complexity. I love learning about history and my topics all the time, but I can't read all the time. This is where our sponsor, The Great Courses...
Shout out from getting his money, man. Deserves it. You know how it is. He deserves it too, man, because his videos are genuinely banging. So the research that goes into him must be big. So yeah, links in the description for that. For those interested, check his video out so you can see the sponsor, but let's get into it.
The main argument I'm going to make here is that we've seen crises across history that break the world system, resulting in mass death, revolution, international war, and huge social upheaval across the planet, and that we're about to experience one of these now. The perfect example of this sort of thing occurring is the crisis of the 14th century. In this era, the Black Death halved Eurasia's population. All of Eurasia became ringed in horrific conflict between the Hundred Years' War, peasant uprisings, the Mongols being driven out of China, and the bloody Ottoman conquest of the Balkans. In Europe, feudalism was replaced by capitalism and eventually resulted in the Reformation, Age of Exploration, and Scientific Revolution. Meanwhile, most of the Asian civilizations had large conservative revolutions. When you're trying to look for them, these crises have been happening with pretty regular frequency. The 6th century is a perfect example of a crisis like this. One also occurred around the birth of Christ, and others around 550 BC, 900 AD.
So, collapse. Is he going to read these out? I'm going to assume he's reading these out so I don't have to read it myself. I'm just going to look quickly. The Black Death, 100 Years' War, collapse of the Yuan, Tamerlane, Ottoman, pillaging.
AD and 200 AD. We're going to look at the two crises that are chronologically closest to the present, and we thus have the most in similar with. The crisis of the 17th and 19th centuries. Imagine a world where wages are stagnant or declining, where globalization has resulted in massive social disturbances, where the poor gather into massive cities around the world looking for work. Inequalities reached horrific proportions and governments corrupt, gridlocked, bureaucratic, and irresponsive to the people's needs. In this world, government desperately tries to inflate their currencies to keep up with rising costs. International conflict seems on the verge of starting while most countries worry about civil wars as political or religious fanaticism reaches a fever pitch. The truth is that I'm simultaneously describing the world in 1610, 1850, and 2020. In the modern world, our story starts after World War II. The ending of the war removed international tariff barriers, and the massive impetus of rebuilding the economy increased manufacturing. Productivity had made massive increases in the previous few decades, and the Western nations didn't have a lot of immigration, birth rates had collapsed before the war, and unions were strong, and so the value of the labor of each individual person was pretty high. The Great Depression destroyed the wealthiest incomes, and the rest was taxed to pay for the war. Inequality was some of the lowest ever in history. This all made 1945 to 1970 in the West and Japan the greatest era to be the common person in history. However, a series of processes started to increase competition for wages. Firstly, immigration and women entering the workforce increased wage competition. I'm not saying these were inherently bad moves. Women and immigrants improved their societies in countless ways, but basic economics dictates when you increase the supply of something and demand can't keep up, then the cost goes down, and when you get down to it, people are a commodity like any other. Massive population growth was also occurring, as the world's population went from 2.5 billion to 8 billion in the last 80 years.
I still can't get my head around that, man. That's absolutely insane. Oh my god, man. In about 10 years, we're going to be at like 8 billion, 9 billion. It's scary, man. It's fucking scary.
This didn't have that big effects in of itself. Africa's population has tripled since the 1960s, but this hasn't had profound effects in the world economy, since Africa isn't that well connected to the rest of the world's economy anyway. What really matters is the growth of the amount of areas competing in the global market. In the 1970s, the economic world that mattered was Western Europe, America, the Antipodes, and Japan. Today it's expanded to East and South Asia, Eastern Europe, and large parts of Latin America. Competition has made life less pleasant for working people. French workers' wages were depressed by Chinese workers, whose wages are in turn depressed by Indonesians. This, combined with massive increases of productivity among the upper classes due to the information revolution, has resulted in staggering amounts of inequality. I've heard the argument before that we need to have low-paid labor for the economy to function. This is true for the modern economic system as it exists, but it's basically class warfare. Americans aren't willing to pick strawberries since the wages are depressed by population growth and immigration. If they weren't, the labor would be significantly more valuable, which would mean Americans would want to do that work. The strawberries would cost significantly more, but the lower classes would live in nicer houses. This is an extremely complex process that I've gone into more detail in other videos, but long story short results in more social instability as the working classes get pissed off at not having their wages grow, while there's an insane struggle to get into the upper class and not be lower class. The struggle explains lots of stuff.
That's just how the rich want it, man. That's how they want it.
High college costs, as people will pay
how they want it. Don't want people coming from the bottom, reaching themselves up, making success of themselves. You see it with the Wall Street thing, not the Wall Street thing, the fucking GameStop thing. What was that? The Robin Hood app. If when they want, they can pick and choose when some people can make money and when they can't, and it just shows, man. There's still that sort of look that the people who come from poorer backgrounds, they want you to sort of stay around that kind of, or they want you to find jobs around that sort of like working class sort of range, I guess you could say. I mean, that's just how it is, isn't it?
Even if it's unsustainable to not be poor, and bloated government bureaucracies as government officials try to get their friends more jobs. Members of the elite form into different factions in order to get people like them more jobs, which results in political instability. As the government becomes more bloated and controlled by special interests, it becomes inefficient and runs higher costs since there isn't a strong consensus on what's important. Inflation runs out of control as it's easier to print money than deal with underlying issues. When government doesn't do things right, people riot, and it often becomes easier to start external wars with the hope of bending the international system than it is to solve internal issues. England, for example, forestalled its civil war by 100 years by uniting its nobility by invading and looting France in the Middle Ages. If we compare all these trajectories to the 17th century, everything lines up. Wages stagnated due to a combination of population growth and globalization, by which Spanish gold from America flooded the European money markets. Inequality reached horrific levels while religious fanaticism gripped the European continent. The cost of education skyrocketed as did inflation. Governments were also highly ineffective. The decades between 1620 and 1660 were horrifying. Some historians estimate that a third of the world's population died in a combination of terrible revolutions, wars, and plague, affecting nearly every nation, such as the Manchu conquest.
Oh my days. Mass plague. There's two just plagues here alone. Wait, what? African slave trade, Ottoman Civil War. Bro, the world was a mess. Famine. I can't even read some of them. Spanish slavery, yellow fever arrivals. Is that when people from other countries or other sort of continents came to the Americas and sort of brought the viruses or whatever they had? And like sort of the people who were there weren't immune to it, so it's like really bad.
West of China, the 30 Years' War, English Civil War, or even famines that killed 1/3 of the Ottoman Empire's population. Is this the future? Possibly yes, but the world has changed since the 17th century in some critical ways.
Will technology save us?
An optimistic look comes from the crisis of the 19th century, a crisis that was so sporadically sprawled over a century that you probably wouldn't see it if you weren't purposely looking for it, and was inverted entirely in some parts of the world due to technological progress. The first parts of the world to face the crisis of the 19th century were Britain and France, who were facing very similar issues to the ones mentioned above around the year 1800. A big reason the American Revolution happened was that the process above had rendered British internal politics overly rigid. The French Revolution was a very similar process. Afterwards, the Hungry Winter of 1821 was one in which the specter of revolution hung over much of Europe, in which the British legal codes would hang a man for stealing bread to feed his own family. Purposely oppressing the lower classes was the order of the day after the French Revolution had been so horrifying. This population grew
again, not to that degree, but there's still that around
Central
now.
Europe around 1850, which resulted in the revolutions of 1848 in places like Italy, the Austrian Empire, and Germany. However, something remarkable happened: the Industrial Revolution. After 1850, the standard of living grew markedly in northwestern Europe as industry improved individual productivity. Farmland opened up in places like the American Midwest and Argentina that collapsed the price of food, and mass production made the cost of life in general cheaper. Excess...
God, there's still... I don't know how long they're going to be going, man. There's been drilling for the last fucking... month, and it's still
population moved to the colonies or the Americas. By the time we get to World War I, inequality had collapsed, and young men of both the right and the left were happy to die for their nations. However, once you look outside the industrialized world, the Americas, by the time we get to World War I, inequality had collapsed, and young men of both the right and the left were happy to die for their nations. However, once you look outside the industrialized world, the picture gets far more grim. China had the Taiping Rebellion, the third bloodiest war in history, which killed somewhere in the range between 20 to 40 million people, alongside humiliation by the Western powers, collapse into warlords, and a period of humiliation that ended with the Japanese invasion in World War II. The year 1876 saw famines in China, India, Scandinavia...
Bro, look at this pit. That is just sad. Oh my god, look at their legs. No, oh my fucking... This is just a shocking picture, man. How people were forced to live like... That is so depressing, bro. I can't get my head around how thin, just how thin they actually are. And how you can still, like, be alive at that point. Like, it's...
in Brazil, that killed somewhere between 30 and 60 million people. A big reason for the massive deaths that occurred in Central and Eastern Europe during the World Wars was because they were experiencing these same population pressures that had built up over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mexico saw two massive waves of death in the long 19th century, one of which being the Wars of Independence and the other being the Mexican Revolution during World War I. However, there's another heartening example, the second half of the 20th century. In the 1970s, there was massive worry that due to the incredible population growth seen at the time, that people would be starving by the end of the century. However, what occurred at this point was that the Green Revolution resulted in massive increases in food production, which allowed the world to have 4 times the population while everyone being better fed. It even allowed the world's farmland to shrink, with there being 15...
Wait, what? Did I hear that correctly? So if there was 4 times the population, there would be enough to feed them. Is that what...
To have 4 times the population while everyone being better fed. It even...
Wait, I need to just hear this through again. This is blowing my mind.
What occurred at this point was that the Green Revolution resulted in massive increases in food production, which allowed the world to have 4 times the population while everyone being better fed.
So there could have been 4 times the population whilst people would still be getting fed, right? Is that what he's saying? Because if that's the case, that is insane. That's absolutely crazy. I never even would have even guessed that. That's wild, man.
It even allowed the world's farmland
if that's
to
the
shrink,
case,
with
course.
there being 15% more forests now than there was in 1990. As of now, there are 800 million undernourished people around the world and 2 billion obese, which is absolutely amazing because for the vast majority of history, there have been far more hungry people than fat people. Processes have become universally more efficient. The peak usage of almost every raw material in Western countries per capita was around 79, and there have often been collapses between 3/4 and half per capita of raw materials because things are just more efficient now. Global carbon emissions have either peaked or will peak in the next 5 years since our engines, agriculture, etc. has just gotten more efficient. There are two conclusions we can draw from the examples above. The first is the standard of living will almost certainly rise by the end of the century. Modern projections, which I don't totally trust, say that by the end...
Really? So it's just going to get hot? I thought there was going to be a point where it wouldn't be able to get high. I thought there was just a limit and it was just going to get worse and worse. But seeing this...
End of the century, your average Bangladeshi will be as rich as your average Dutchman.
Really? I mean, that's what we want, right? But that's still just... I would not have assumed that.
Revolutions in everything between biotech, nuclear energy, individual productivity, and stuff we don't even understand today will undoubtedly make the world a far richer place by the end of the century. However, in the short term, as we'll talk about soon, much of the world is close enough to crisis point that we may not have enough time to have a technological revolution to raise the standard of living fast enough to prevent it. Similarly, only the first world countries would be able to pull this...
So first world... This is Chile, right? You got the Americas, or you got Canada and the US, you got Europe. I think it's the majority of Europe, right? Second world, third world, you got Japan, South Korea, you got Australia, New Zealand.
This off effect.
You got, what is that? Saudi Arabia, I think? No, that's not. What is this? That's Israel? I don't know, it's one of those countries. It's interesting how it's sort of here, it's just, and then it's just sort of sparsely spread out.
And quickly, leaving much of the rest of the world in terrible shape. This will have large effects going forward.
Wait, what? I'm literally dropping this map for the sole purpose of triggering the comment section.
You should be able to pull this off effectively and quickly, leaving much of the rest of the world in terrible shape. This will have large effects going forward. Another important thing to consider is that in a lot of ways we're hobbling our abilities to make innovations.
100 years, man, it's changed so much.
I've heard the argument that technological innovation has really slowed down compared to the 1860-1970 period. That's accurate, but it's a terrible frame of reference, since 1860-1970 was the greatest era of technological progress ever, and so comparing ourselves to it is like saying, oh, I'm so lame, I'm just Alexander, I'm not even close to Genghis Khan. However, there is a grain of truth in it. Practically all the technologies we have now were invented due to war, with the vast majority of hot new technologies having been invented during World War II. The exceptions are GMOs, which were a real miracle, and the internet, which was invented due to the Cold War. In general, private industry is amazing at making...
Antibiotics, World War One, enhanced agriculture in the 30s, computers, nuclear energy, cell phones, World War Two, the internet. The internet in the 60s, what? Genetic engineering in the 70s.
Incremental advances, but massive breakthroughs are almost entirely from government research due to war. However, government investment in science has declined markedly since the Cold War stopped being competitive and there wasn't an external opponent. Government regulation has done tremendous ills to scientific research. Lots of industries like nuclear, genetic engineering, and even basic things like manufacturing are so regulated as to make putting research in them foolish, giving it how much smaller the payout would be through government regulation. And the sad thing is these industries have massive capability to benefit the world in countless ways. Many insiders in the computer field have said that the computer revolution occurred because it was so obscure that no one was there to regulate it. In a lot of ways, the major world
crises, they could just sort of done it without people sort of looking at it. That's sort of, I guess, what he means by it. Like, no one was paying notice of it, and it just sort of came out of nowhere in a sense.
Might promulgate higher investment into science that might create the tools that allow the crisis to get solved in the end. Before we continue, I just want to make a shameless plug. One of my employees at What If Altist and one of my own personal best friends is making his own YouTube channel about World War II history, and his content's really good. And I just wanted to shout him out here. Check out his channel, the link in the description.
Again, if you're interested, links in the description. Well, I'll find the link for this in the description. You can check this out as well. I'm going to check this channel too, man. I love these sorts of videos, so I'm definitely down to see that.
All of this depressing material really makes one ask, is it all really that bad? I mean, for most people in the West, life remains quite comfortable. The only countries where people really starve are for political reasons in places like North Korea, South Sudan, Yemen, etc. The last 30 years have seen massive economic growth around the world. People are far richer than they've ever been before in history. This is all true, but it's looking at it from the wrong perspective. The systems that allowed that wealth to form are breaking down. I remember watching a movie from the 1970s called Soylent Green. It was at the year 2022 in which Earth had become super overpopulated, and major spoiler alert, the only way mankind survives is by cannibalism. Real apocalyptic scientific projections show the ice caps melting by the end of the century, and much of the tropics becoming uninhabitable due to overheating. I think both of these are implausible, since ecological tripwires and inefficiency in the human system mean collapses happen before you reach real Malthusian limits. There are a few massive pieces of concern that make me very worried at the world system, however. A wrong way of viewing this is that we're actually on the edge of a Malthusian collapse. We could easily support far more people on this planet, and if we removed super inefficient stuff like beef production, we could raise that threshold even higher. It's just that our current social order is inefficient. Look at housing in America. America's a super open and massive country with lots of living space and plenty of pleasant, cheap mid-level cities. However, the good jobs are clustered in crowded, overpriced cities, and so rent prices there are insane. It's similar to France before the Revolution, which starving, overcrowded peasant lands sat next to massive noble hunting estates. Similarly, the Spanish Empire in 1650 saw overpopulation in the core lands in Spain, but severe underpopulation in the American colonies. You can tell that we're sitting very close to tripwires by looking at human well-being metrics. You can tell how desperate a society is by looking at a series of rough human metrics that tell you how healthy a total society is, and the world now is really desperate by looking at them. The first is a system historian Peter Turchin developed to look at the amount of people in the upper class and compare that to wage stagnation, and use it to project social instability. His computer models have projected crises ranging from the fall of the Roman Republic to the Russian Revolution on the timescales they actually occurred at in history. His algorithm in 2010 projected the 2020s would be a decade of massive instability in America. Europe's in a very similar position, meanwhile, if you replace unemployment for inequality. Inequality rates are often highly indicative of political instability, where once you hit a certain threshold, there's almost always going to be a social collapse. Similarly, interestingly enough, once the average age of marriage exceeds around age 27 or 28, you're probably going to have a major crisis, since later dates of marriage suggest greater hardship among the population. Similarly, declines in birth rate beneath the replacement
How do they even link those two things? That's insane.
level are also highly indicative of major crises for the same reason. We could use stuff like weight gains and declines in sleep quality as similar metrics of a collapse in well-being.
So let's read the other ones. I do like to see these ones. So human well-being metrics that have seen worsening effects in America since the 80s. Obesity, amount of sleep, declining height, increased suicide, increased depression, shortening lifespan for white males, higher opioid use, less sex, less sperm, stress, anxiety, less friends, socializing, less attendance of community organisation, increasing single-parent households.
And declines in sleep quality as similar metrics of a collapse in well-being. I'm only looking at data for America here, since that's what I have, but the trajectories for later marriage rates, buying houses later, less sleep, etc.
This is a 14-year-old as well. Self-harm, depressive symptoms, tried alcohol, assaulted someone.
Are true in basically the...
Look, it's just going up. And it's weird how some are going up, but some are going down.
Entire world. An interesting thing is the standard of living itself is often less important than relative stress. The French and Russian revolutions, for example, both occurred after technological revolutions that rose the standard of living materially, but a peasant society in which people marry young and are able to establish themselves at a young age is far more stable than a more technologically developed one where young people feel incapable of reaching the goals or their expectations. Social media is almost certainly jacking this horrific process through the roof. Firstly, it creates a system in which people view the curated, perfect versions of other people's lives while being stuck with all their insecurities and the sucky parts of their lives. Secondly, it creates comparisons between regions where that otherwise wouldn't happen, provoking envy and insecurity. How is life in the Baltimore ghetto manageable when you see videos of Beverly Hills every day?
Yeah,
life in a
that's Instagram for you, bro. You'll be living your life wherever it is. You could be poor, living like a one-bedroom house with like 5-6 different people, struggling every single day, and you'll be watching things on Instagram or YouTube showing you these influencers. Oh, we're in Beverly Hills. Look at our house. Or people showing off places on TikToks. I'm such a boomer, bro. Like my girlfriend she watches so many sort of like house tours of the richest people on TikTok again, and it's just like I can see why this would be so sort of depressing for people and just cause like worries in their head or whatever it is, make them feel sad, depressed, lonely, like whatever it is. And it's because of things like that.
Jack in Cairo when you know about the Netherlands. A major issue here is that significant parts of the world's population live in recently urbanized megacities. People crowd into tenements and struggle to find work, slaving long hours when they can find it, and often live outside the law with little hope of getting a stable life to start a good family. Their societies move from peasant to urban in a generation, and so their culture is incapable of adapting that fast to people's needs. This stage of development, or basically early industrialization, begs for major wars and revolutions afterwards.
And this is where I'm going to stop. This is pretty much halfway through part 4, broad overview of problems. This is interesting, man. Again, I said I'm going to post them at the same time. I'm going to post one at like 8 o'clock UK time, one an hour later. So it's just sort of, it gives the first one a bit of time to sort of get watched in the second one. But yeah, this is another insane video. I'm not even going to read the comments yet because, again, I'm going to read them for this part 2, which I'm going to react to in a few minutes. I'm just going to have to wait for my package to arrive. But yeah, hopefully you enjoy this one. Again, banging channel. Links in the description to this video if you want to watch this full on your own. And yeah, man, until next time, like, subscribe. Peace.